Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for organizing this great event. It's an honor for me to have a moment to say a few words. And I also want to thank you and Elizabeth for your visionary and very effective leadership of the Impact Investing Institute. Critical momentum that you've established at a critical time. And I think, as you've just said, that really one of the only bright lights in 2020 has been what has developed on the impact investing side, what the momentum we now have with addressing climate change and the imperative we have to move that forward over the course of the next year through to COP to really capitalize on it. And a bit of that, last week I had the opportunity to record the Wreath Lecture, so small plug for that here. And the title of the talks, there were 4 talks, was How We Get What We Value. And what I was trying to do was to focus on the relationship between financial value and society's values, how the two can come into conflict and have been in conflict in recent years and decades, but also how we can make them mutually reinforcing. And of course, making them mutually reinforcing touches on the promise of impact investing. Really, impact investing is at its most powerful when it unleashes the power of the market in the service of society's goals. And over the course of this year, we have been reminded of what we value: sustainability, solidarity, fairness, and resilience. Now, when we know what we value, we can pursue addressing climate change, pursue achieving net zero rather than balancing planet and profit, or we can pursue the imperative of health outcomes and then try to do that in the most effective fashion. Impact investing can turn what can appear at first to be insurmountable problems into tremendous commercial opportunities. And that's what is happening at the moment with climate change, finally. As this audience knows, investors and creditors are increasingly considering ESG factors along traditional financial ones when they're allocating capital. And ESG investing itself is moving well beyond negative screening. So screening out of companies with poor standards towards finding companies that are truly creating value. The majority of ESG strategies or increasing majority of ESG strategies are focusing on a form of divine coincidence. In other words, doing well by doing good, by seeking to identify common factors that support either risk management and value creation in order to enhance longer-term risk-adjusted returns. These approaches encompass both responsible investing, which largely uses ESG for risk mitigation, and sustainable investing, which adopts progressive ESG practices that are expected to enhance longer-term economic value. Now, impact investing, as this group knows, supports positive social and environmental benefits alongside financial returns. And impact investing strategies, different impact investing strategies, strike this balance along a spectrum. Finance first strategies, and I'm using the taxonomy of the Institute, finance first strategies seek to generate competitive financial returns alongside achieving those environmental and social values. Impact first strategies accept below market returns, and value-based investing aligns portfolios with moral values, accepting that in some cases, and in fact expecting in some cases, that there will be a partial, if not complete, loss of capital in a philanthropic effort to achieve broader social goals. Now, what I want to do with the balance of my remarks is to focus on finance first impact strategies, and specifically how an impact-driven investing approach can help solve the climate crisis and generate competitive returns as we transition to net zero. In my view, these strategies have the prospect of becoming mainstream because of the greater weight that society is now placing on addressing climate change. And as I said at the outset, this combination of what society values is creating the greater, if not the greatest, commercial opportunity of our age. Certainly, the performance of broader ESG strategies is encouraging. meta-analysis of over 2,000 studies confirms that the economic case for ESG investment is tangible. 90% of those studies find that there is no penalty on return on ESG investments. So it's a question of why not as opposed to why. And the majority suggest that focusing on ESG criteria generates alpha, positive returns. There's substantial evidence that this outperformance continued during the intense period of market volatility, both up and down, experienced over the course of 2020 because of the COVID crisis. Now, the question is, why is there that superior performance? And there's several possible reasons, alone or in combination. The first is that companies that score high on ESG may be better able to manage episodic downside risk. That makes them more strategically resilient, and we've seen examples during this crisis, and it makes them better able to adapt to future risks and opportunities. This translates across all the ESG strategies to substantial evidence of greater longevity of ESG funds. On average, 3/4 of sustainable funds available to investors a decade ago are still in operation, whereas for more traditional funds, the proportion is less than half. Secondly, ESG funds and ESG factors may provide new information about company performance and superior management. Strong ESG scores could signal that a firm is well run and more naturally disposed to longer term strategic thinking and planning. Research finds that when companies increasingly focus on sustainability, they significantly outperform the market, generating alpha of more than 3 percentage points annually. Thirdly, there is evidence that financial valuations of strong ESG performers increase as the values of societies move in their directions. And I think that's part of what is going on today. For example, the more that society values the transition to net zero, the more valuable companies that are part of the solution will be because of the greater demand for their products, as well as developments in regulation and carbon pricing that support society's objectives. And I think one of the dynamics is that COVID has created a demand for a strategic reset for business for a variety of reasons. It's going to be relatively unusual that a company's strategy going into this crisis, this unforeseen crisis, was perfectly aligned with the social, technological, and environmental factors that are driving value coming out of it. There will be high expectations for company strategies as they come out of this crisis to consider the most pressing issues for people and planet. In particular, given that net zero is both an imperative of climate physics and an objective, an explicit objective, in many cases a legislated objective of 126 countries and counting, that strategy should include a pathway to net zero. Investors, and from impact investors and then moving into the mainstream, will increasingly need to assess how well companies are positioned for this transition. So in other words, who's on the right and the wrong side of climate history, which companies have momentum and which will fall by the wayside. To make these judgments, the first thing that's necessary is climate-related financial disclosures from companies. We all know what gets measured gets managed. Backed by investors, the banks, insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds now that support the TCFD, which is the gold standard for climate-related disclosures, now total $170 trillion. This is a set of recommendations that were developed by the market for the market, and they're increasingly essential. In order to make the TCFD comprehensive and consistent, we need to make it mandatory. That's increasingly obvious. The private sector has brought this along as far as it can. The demand for this disclosure is overwhelming. The supply is responding, but it needs to be made mandatory so that it's consistent and comprehensive. And the UK's, the Chancellor's announcement 2 weeks ago, the UK's roadmap for mandatory climate reporting is a watershed event. For COP26, we are going to work with other countries to establish pathways to make TCFD disclosure mandatory. including with international standard setters, particularly the IFRS, who's currently consulting on climate risk reporting, reporting standards and broader sustainability standards in order to shape the future. These disclosures need to be accompanied by forward-looking disclosures, including of net zero transition plans. Every company, and certainly every major company, is going to need to evolve its business model for net zero. And what's started to emerge over the course of the last year or so is some best practice in this regard. Emerging best practices include publishing objectives for scope 1, 2, and 3 targets, balancing absolute emissions reduction with appropriate use of offsets, oversight at the board level, and tying executive compensation to the achievement of these metrics. By COP, a year from now, the absence of a transition plan will likely be seen as either an intention to wind down a business over the coming decades, or an assertion that the company is separate or views itself as separate from society. The former, winding down, may be logical. The latter, being apart from society, is unforgivable. Now, rather than have public authorities be overly prescriptive on these transition plans, it may be more desirable for investors to have a say on transition. In other words, an automatic advisory vote on transition plans, just as investors currently have a say on pay. This would establish a critical link between responsibility, sustainability, and accountability. Now, over time, investors won't just judge company transition plans, they too shall be judged. Investors will need to demonstrate their impact on the planet. And the challenge for the industry is to make a material and meaningful metric so that people, their clients, can make their money matter. Any such metric needs to be forward-looking, anchored in real-world climate targets, and it needs to be dynamic, in other words, adjusting for developments in technology. Existing climate metrics serve useful roles, but they're not best suited for measuring a whole economy transition, the whole economy transition that we need in order to get to net zero. Carbon footprints and CO2 emissions per dollar or pound invested aren't forward-looking, they're static. ESG metrics are inconsistent, poorly correlated in general, and the E in ESG is not benchmarked to net zero. And taxonomies capture only a small proportion of business activity. They can't chart the progress through 50 shades of green and are not yet dynamic enough to account for new technologies. So to address these shortcomings, earlier this month, the TCFD, under David Blood of Generation Asset Investment Management, David Blood's leadership, published a report which examined several methodologies. The first was looking at the percentage of assets that are net zero aligned, in other words, assets from companies that have net zero transition plans. Secondly, progress in reducing GHG emissions versus transition pathways by sector. And then finally, calculation of a degree warming metric to assess the quality of transition plans to achieve the Paris goals. Now, in many respects, the degree warming metric gives an intuitive answer to the question, how much of my portfolio is contributing, or to what degree is my portfolio contributing to warming the planet? Indeed, with early calculations of some of the largest pension funds indicating that our capital markets are funding temperature increases of over 3 degrees, a striking gap emerges between what society wants and what the market values. And the challenge, and by publishing these numbers, it will help close that gap. Now, the challenge with an implied temperature warming metric is that its calculation depends on a range of assumptions. And so a simpler and potentially powerful alternative is a forward-looking metric of greenhouse gas reductions and a move of assets to Paris alignment consistent with a growing body of work on optimal transition paths. So think science-based target initiatives for transition paths. And some of the world's largest and most influential investors are making such commitments. The members of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, with over $5 trillion under management, have contributed to manage, or have committed to manage down their carbon footprints by up to 29%, preferably on a scope 3 basis by 2025, and to be at net zero by 2050. And I would expect that such metrics-based approaches to managing the transition to become increasingly common. But it suffice to say that in the run-up to Glasgow, investors should try to agree how best to demonstrate how the extent to which their clients' investments are aligned with climate targets. And David Blood's report is now out for consultation, and I would encourage this group to share your views so that we can work towards developing that consensus. So to conclude, there's no algorithm, black box, or magic index that is going to get us to net zero. Impact investing to address climate change involves fundamental analysis and judgments about forward-looking transition paths. It will back the best of those paths with the capital needed to transform our economies as part of this sustainable revolution. And the need for capital is great. In response, more and more companies are crafting business strategies grounded in purpose that address these most pressing issues for our planet. Businesses of all stripes are recognizing that changing consumer preferences and new climate policies are creating this enormous commercial opportunity. The most forward-looking investors are responding to this shift by focusing on an opportunity of a lifetime, which is also an opportunity for our lifetimes. And if we get this right, the objective for COP26, that every financial decision takes climate change into account, will be realized. The climate transition will be mainstreamed, and we will get what we value. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful conference.